This video is going to focus on the integumentary system. Please keep in mind that you should be using your textbook resources as well as the discussion boards and thinking about worksheets for studying. And if the material is not covered in the chapter reading guides or the module review guides, you would not be expected to know it for the exam. So the integumentary system is the first body system that we start to focus on in A&P. So now that we've got chapters 1 through 5 under our belt, we have a good firm foundation for understanding the systems. So when we start to look at the integumentary system, we are focused on the skin and the subcutaneous tissue. And figure 6.1 is an excellent figure that shows you the relationship between the three layers that, when combined, create our actual skin. Now, you'll notice that the root word dermis is present in all of the terms for the layers. And the dermis itself is made up of connective tissue, primarily loose areolar tissue and reticular tissue the further you get down. But a lot of the sense organs and blood vessels go through the dermal layer. The outermost layer that's in contact with the environment is the epidermis, which stands for above the dermis. The epidermis is made up of stratified epithelial cells, meaning that there's many layers of cells, specifically there's squamous cells, and it acts as a very strong barrier to the outside world. Then below the dermis, you'll notice the hypodermis, which is also known as the subcutaneous layer or the subcutaneous fat layer. That layer is primarily made up of adipose tissue, which are our fat cells and the corresponding fat extracellular material. And we have larger blood vessels within that area as well. So the functions of the skin are really important to understand, because although this seems like a very simple system, there's lots of things that it performs for our body, and without it, we would not be able to survive. First, it is able to help us resist trauma and infection, primarily because of the epidermis and the keratin, which is a densely packed protein that material has to move through. It also has a slightly acid composition to it, so the pH is lower, and there's salt that is present that both help to prevent infections. It has other barrier functions against water and UV radiation and other harmful chemicals. We also have the initial step of vitamin D synthesis, which is absolutely necessary for functioning in almost every other body system. Vitamin D begins to be formed in the skin, but the liver and the kidneys actually finish the process, so that way it's usable in the other body systems. The skin is also a very extensive sense organ with the amount of receptors that are present. It includes receptors for temperature detection, for touch, for pain, and a lot of other sensations as well. The skin is also one of our main thermoregulators in the body because of the thermoreceptors. It lets us know if we're hot or cold. And the blood vessels in our skin, depending on if they are constricting or dilating, so vasoconstriction versus vasodilation, vasoconstriction would help us to conserve heat to the core of our body. Vasodilation would allow us to let more heat dissipate from our blood vessels. So it's one of the reasons why when you get hot, you may notice that your skin gets more flushed or red in appearance. And it's because vasodilation has taken place, and it's to try to help cool our body. In addition, the cooling mechanism that our skin has uses our sweat glands for perspiration, which allows for evaporative cooling. The other thing that our skin does, if we focus primarily on our facial expressions, it allows for nonverbal communication. I always joke that during the pandemic, when I was wearing my mask, I didn't have to pay that much attention to how my face appeared when I was talking to other people. But then when we became unmasked, I kind of had to retrain my face to give the appropriate expression for different social settings. And our nonverbal communication is also important in our own self-image. So now that you have the overview of the structures of the skin, we are going to focus specifically on each of the layers, starting with the epidermis. So the epidermis is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. This means that it is dead cells at the surface of the skin that are packed with tough keratin protein, which also helps again with a protective barrier function. And the squamous portion is indicating the cell appearance, and stratified means there's many, many layers of them. So the epidermis, when you look at it more closely, can get divided into its own layering system, which each layer gets the main word stratum, which is a single layer or single strata of the epidermis. And each strata was identified based on its location and its functions. So the terminology comes from that particular part. But working your way from the apex of the epithelial tissue to the basement membrane, you have your stratum corneum, your stratum lucidum, your stratum granulosum, your stratum spinosum, and your stratum basal layer. Before I keep going, I want to give you a little mnemonic trick that I use to help me remember the layers of the epidermis. And since all of them start with stratum, I kind of ignore that for my mnemonic device. But the saying I use is, "Come, let's get sunburned." And that relates to corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basal. So when I'm identifying the functions of each of these different layers, it's helpful to also understand what kind of cells you find in each of those layers. So we're going to start from the basement membrane, which has this kind of a wave-like appearance to it. And we're going to work our way to the apex. So from deep to superficial. So in the stratum basal layer, there is essentially a single layer of more cuboidal shaped cells that they are resting on the basement membrane. Those cells are where the site of mitosis takes place to keep giving cells to the continuing rising process of this protective layer. The cells consist of stem cells, which your stem cells are your undifferentiated cells that are going to give rise to other cell types in this area, which include the keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are the cells that produce your keratin. There's melanocytes in this layer as well that produce your melanin. And then there are also tactile cells in this area, which is involved in our sensory system. So you're not really able to distinguish these cells type in this particular layer using regular staining processes, but you can almost always spot your melanin, because melanin is a brown pigment that shows up. So if we look more at the true histological image, which is 6.3a, you'll notice that there's this brown layer. That brown color you're seeing is eumelanin or true melanin. And what's really fascinating with our melanocytes is that our melanocytes, every single person has approximately the same number of melanocytes, but our skin color is dictated by the amount of melanin our skin produces. And this is genetically based, but there's also some phenotypic plasticity with it, that when you are exposed to UV radiation, that your skin will actually cause your melanocytes to produce more melanin than it would regularly. And it's because melanin actually acts as a protective measure from UV radiation. Since these are the location of cell division, it's trying to protect those. So skin color is not only genetically based, but it's also environmentally based. And the only difference between skin appearances is just the amount of melanin, which is a protein that we end up making. So as you move away from the basement membrane in that stratum basal layer, we start to get into the stratum spinosum layer. The stratum spinosum layer is the thickest layer of living cells. Those are your living keratinocytes. There's also other sense cells in here, the dendritic cells, your tactile cells, but it's called spinosum because in my eyes, it always has these little spiky parts that are having each of the cells connecting to one another. Essentially, this layer is just many, many layers of keratinocytes. They're typically shrunk in this fixed tissue, but they get attached to each other through cell connections called desmosomes. And it gives them that spiny appearance. It's basically those little spiky things between each of them. It's a little easier to see in the drawing than in the histology image. But with this particular region, you can't really distinguish much else than there's lots of layers of these squished cells. As we keep going towards the surface, we get to this layer referred to as the stratum granulosum. And the stratum granulosum is typically only a couple layers of cells thick, and it has a darker appearance because of essentially the granules in them that produces the keratin. This particular layer definitely has that darker appearance, and it's because you can see protein granules in it. Now, the next layer, the stratum lucidum layer, is a layer that you typically only see in thick skin, and it is essentially a transparent or light. So lucid is light. That layer appears there because as you get to the dead keratinocytes at the top, you get this variation from the living granulosum cells to the corneum layer, and you get this light appearance between the two of them. And then the stratum corneum layer, I always relate to when people like develop corns or calluses, that it is a really, really thick layer of dead keratinocytes, which means that it is primarily just keratin that is present. And in this particular layer, whenever you exfoliate, this is the cells that you are scraping off, essentially. And we'll come back to this in a little bit when we talk more about acne. But the corneum layer, whenever you exfoliate, is you're getting rid of the dead skin cells on the surface. And because mitosis is continually occurring in the stratum basal layer, that this whole set of layers is replaced on a regular basis. If you are still struggling with this topic, I would recommend focusing on table 6.1 and potentially making flashcards to help you with it. But I'm going to switch gears and we're going to focus on the dermis. And the dermis is the thickest layer of our skin. And what's really fascinating about the dermis is that depending on the area of your body, the dermal layer can have different thicknesses. Like our eyelids are going to be thinner than the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. The dermal layer is mostly connective tissue, and the extracellular material is primarily collagen that you find in this. The other part that you'll see here is that the darker blue that it is in the histology image, you can see that it creates like this wave that some parts reach up into the epidermis, where some parts of the epidermis actually reach down into the dermal layer. And these little extensions of the dermis is referred to as the papillary layer. Specifically, it has connective tissue in the form of loose connective tissue or the areolar tissue. It allows for leukocytes to move around and other defense cells, and it's rich in small capillary blood vessels. Now, as you get further down in the dermal layer, so you're getting deeper, you get reticular tissue, which it's really thick or dense irregular connective tissue. And this is the layer that if you do develop stretch marks or scarring, that you would see it in this particular layer. Now, the dermal layer, not only does it have a lot of blood vessels in it, it is also what contains your sweat glands, it contains your sebaceous glands, and it houses your hair follicles, your nail roots. Muscles of facial expression are attached to the dermal layer, which is why we get those nonverbal communication things from our facial expressions. And the other thing, that the waving of your papillary layer is what causes us to have the folds of our skin, which gives us each a different type of fingerprint, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to move on to the dermal, or the hypodermal region. And this particular histology image is one that I took myself of the scalp, or the slide is a cross section of the scalp. And you'll notice that you can see the really thin, dark purple towards the top of this, and you have the apical surface where the lumen is. That is your epithelial tissue. That's your stratified squamous epithelium. The keratinocytes, that are the dead cells of the stratum corneum, you can actually see the little flaking that's occurring on top of the epidermis. And then just below that, you see a lighter pink, and the lighter pink is where your dermal layer is. And this is made up of your loose irregular connective tissue, the areolar and the reticular. The other thing that you'll notice is about halfway down, you can see the little windows almost of each adipose site that is housing the adipose or fat, and that is your hypodermis. The hypodermis is what we call subcutaneous tissue. It does contain more areolar tissue, but it is primarily your adipose tissue. It helps to pad and protect your body, and it binds skin to the underlying tissues. This is also a common site of drug injection due to the numerous blood vessels that you see in this area. And the subcutaneous fat is really kind of an energy reservoir. It functions with thermoregulation, so insulation, and most infants and women will have a higher body percentage of fat, and it is based on the adipose in the dermal, or in the hypodermal region. Now, the other thing when we look at the hypodermis, or actually at this image before I keep going, you can see that we've got some hair follicles that we can see sort of a transverse section of them. You can also see some of the glands that are in this. We'll talk about the glands in just a couple of slides, but those glands are primarily in the dermal layer, and your follicles of your hairs can also go further into the hypodermis. So I have already talked about the variations in skin pigmentation, but it is truly based on the melanocytes producing melanin in the stratum basal layer. The more melanin you produce, the browner your skin pigmentation would be. And truly, skin color is dictated by the environment as well as our genetics. And all of us have the same number of melanocytes. It just depends on how much melanin those cells produce that dictate our skin color. Remember, I've already mentioned the term phenotypic plasticity, that there is some variation, that everybody can get a little bit darker based on sun exposure, and everybody can also get a little paler when they lack sun exposure. The other thing with skin is that there is a relationship between UV exposure and the pigmentation that you see. The more UV light exposure you have, it tends to stimulate more melanin secretion, and it darkens your skin. The other thing that the UV light exposure does is that it stimulates your vitamin D synthesis. And what this helps to happen is a lot of the regulation of vitamin D within our body. But evolutionarily speaking, when we try to look at distribution of skin pigmentation in humans globally, there is actually a relationship between darker skin being present closer to the equator, and then as you move further towards the poles, skin overall lightens, and it has to do with the amount of UV radiation that we're exposed to. So historically, if we look at where our ancestors came from, you can often sort of determine why you would have different skin pigmentations in different regions of the world. Because of global transport now, it doesn't always hold true because we travel all over and some people settle farther away from where their families originated. So you see that. Now, as far as skin pigmentation goes as well, the melanin is supposed to protect us from harmful UV rays, but the UV rays, when you're exposed to them, can cause skin cancer, and it can also cause a breakdown in folate, which is your vitamin B. Vitamin B is responsible for normal cell division. It also aids in fertility and fetal development. So our skin color is sort of a balancing act between stimulating vitamin D synthesis and preventing folate breakdown. So there is definitely a balancing act. If you're exposed to too much UV light, you would get a lot of vitamin D, but not enough vitamin B. So there is definitely a homeostatic mechanism that we try to maintain a certain level of UV exposure versus the protection. The other thing that I want to address while I talk about skin pigmentation is that there's other pigments that influence your skin color. It's not just melanin. Melanin is what helps with the brown range, but hemoglobin, which most of us are familiar with hemoglobin when it comes to our red blood cells, but hemoglobin is actually a red pigment in our blood cells. And it can add a reddish or a pinkish hue to our skin. If you exercise and you have more vasodilation in certain areas, I know I get really red cheeks when I get overly hot. It's one of the ways that our body tries to cool us, but the pigment you're seeing is actually from hemoglobin. Keratin is another pigment that is sometimes present. It's actually always present, but sometimes you see it more than others. It's a yellowish or orangish pigment that you can acquire from egg yolks and yellow and orange vegetables. A lot of infants that if you give them sweet potatoes or carrots or anything that has the really orange color to it, sometimes you see that orangeness appear in their skin. It tends to concentrate in the stratum corneum and the subcutaneous fat, which is sometimes why you see it more in infants because they tend to have more fat than adults. We can also use skin pigmentation or different skin colors to link things to disease. Your book gives you 2 images, but there's a lot of other variations. So I'm going to address the ones that are on the image, then I'm going to talk about a couple of the others. So albinism is when your skin appears white, and also typically your hair would appear white because of a genetic lack of melanin. The other picture up here is jaundice, which jaundice is when you get the yellowing of your skin and the whites of your eyes. It's due to having bilirubin in your blood, which is an indication that you're having compromised liver function. Other types of diagnostic colors, if someone appears blue, it's called cyanosis, but that's due to an oxygen deficiency. There's also pallor, which when your skin gets completely pale and it's due to a decrease of blood flow to that area. A lot of people exhibit pallor when they're about to get sick. There's like this drainage of blood from the face and you can visibly see that. Hematomas are when you get the bruising, which is truly clotted blood underneath your skin. And there's lots of other variations to skin pigmentations and colors that can detect if there's any type of pathogenic issues. So switching from the skin, I want to talk about hair and nails. So this section, you are not expected to know all of the details of, but I do want you to be aware that your hair and your nails are accessory organs of your skin, and they are composed mostly of dead keratinized cells. The pliable soft keratin that makes up the stratum corneum of our skin is different than the keratin that you find in the hair and nails. Hair and nails has compact, hard keratin. It's tougher and more compact due to having a lot more cross linkages between the keratin molecules. So basically think of it more as a webbed system, that there's lots of overlap and there's more of them. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time focusing on hair, and then we'll move into the cutaneous glands, which are also accessory organs of the skin. So when it comes to hair types, your book talks about lanugo, which I could not find a good picture of lanugo because it's technically considered fetal hair. Typically, it's this really, really fine and downy, unpigmented hair that is present on the fetus. And it shows up normally in like the last 3 months of development when the fetus is in utero. And normally it's kind of sloughs off or falls out before birth. Some infants are born with it, but most lanugo is present during fetal development and it is gone during the last trimester. The other types of hair include vellus and terminal hair. Vellus hair is really fine hair that replaces the lanugo by the time of birth. This is typically 2/3 of the hair of women as adults and about 1/10 of the hair of men as adults. It is essentially all of the hair that you see in children. The exceptions to this rule is that it's the eyebrows, the eyelashes, and the scalp hair, which tends to be the longer, coarser, more pigmented hair. We refer to terminal hair when we are looking at body hair that is, again, longer, coarser, and more heavily pigmented. It's found in, again, the eyebrows, eyelashes, the hair of the scalp. And after puberty, it is what forms in the axillary regions, which are your armpits, and pubic hair. And then this is also the hair that you find in male facial hair and some of the hair on the trunks and the limbs. Women do experience terminal hair in other areas of the body as well. Typically areas that you focus on shaving is the areas that we have the terminal hair. Now, another accessory organ of the skin that I want to talk about while we're looking specifically at hair is the piloerector muscle, which is also referred to as the erector pili muscle. So a lot of people think that the piloerector muscle has stuck around just because there's an evolutionary basis to it, but it really doesn't do much for us in terms of survival or not. It is a small, smooth muscle that attaches the follicle, so your hair follicle, to the dermis. And when it's relaxed, your hair just kind of lays to the side. But when it gets contracted, what essentially happens is it causes your hair to stand on end. And it's thought that it could produce a little bit of heat. So that way, if it's cold out and you are starting to have the shivering mechanism that takes place, that it can cause your hair to stand on end. But there's other things as far as stimuli that cause this to happen. And it has more to do with our autonomic nervous system, which we'll get into in the last few modules this semester. But it's like if you hear a certain song or a certain pitch noise, that it can cause your hair to stand on end as well. It's when you, my grandmother used to refer to it as the goose pimples or goose flesh when you have all of your hair standing on end. So the erector pili muscles truly are what get your hair to stand on end. And as far as physiologically, why it does this, there's a lot of different stimuli that can cause it. And again, evolutionarily speaking, it doesn't contribute a lot to body warmth, so it may not have a true function anymore. It's something that we refer to as a vestigial trait, something that sticks around because our ancestors had it, but it currently doesn't serve a large purpose anymore. There are actually nerve endings that surround the follicles that if, say, an insect is crawling along and your hair senses it, that we would be able to detect that something is on the surface of our skin from those nerve endings, but not the muscle itself. The other thing along the line of hair is hair color and texture. Now, when I say texture, I'm looking at a cross-sectional shape of the hair. So all of these images are showing a cross-section, and straight hair, a cross-section is round. Wavy hair, the cross-section is oval, and curly hair is relatively flat or more oblong. The color is determined by pigment granules that are in the cells of the cortex or the outer layer of the inner layer of your hair shaft itself. Brown hair, so the one in part B, brown and black hair, they are really rich in eumelanin in that cortex. Your red hair is really concentrated in pheomelanin, which is a lighter pigment. Blonde hair has an intermediate amount of pheomelanin, but very little eumelanin. When you look at gray hair, if you look at the medulla, which is the most inner part of the hair, it now is an open space. There's air in here, and there is no melanin or very minimal melanin within the cortex anymore. And that's what is contributing to having gray hair. When you dye your hair, you are actually dyeing the surface of the hair, which is why it does hold in the hair that you dyed. Sometimes it fades though, because that outer layer is exposed to environmental conditions, and roots are going to be where the hair is growing from the actual scalp. So you have to continue to dye the hair at the scalp. Otherwise, it's going to be the original pigment of your hair. So switching gears from hair, I want to talk about the accessory glands of the accessory structures of cutaneous glands. Now, there are 4 major types of glands that we have that are considered cutaneous glands. There's sweat glands, there's sebaceous glands, there's ceruminous glands, and there's mammary glands. Now, the sweat glands, I'm not going to ask you to distinguish the eccrine versus the apocrine glands. Both of them produce sweat, and sweat functions in perspiration, which helps with evaporative cooling. The primary difference between them, if you are more curious, is that the eccrine style sweat gland is the one that we have the most numerous amount of them on our body. It is more dense on the palms of our hands, the soles of our feet, our forehead, and they're just simple tubular shaped glands. The sweat that it produces is just kind of a watery perspiration, and that's what helps to cool the body. The apocrine glands, these sweat glands are actually inactive until puberty, and they are highly concentrated in the groin, the anal region, the axilla, areola, beard in men, and the ducts lead to a nearby hair follicle. They produce a sweat that is more milky and it has fatty acids, and it's normally a response to stress or sexual stimulation. A lot of scientists also think that they are believed to secrete pheromones, which can influence the behavior of others without conscious control. And then body odor primarily comes from those apocrine glands. So apocrine are the stinky ones, the eccrine are the ones that are all over our body, and they both function in producing perspiration. The sebaceous glands typically are close to a hair follicle, and they produce sebum, which is an oily secretion. The Function of the oil is actually to keep the skin and hair from becoming dry and brittle and cracked. And it's sometimes individuals will utilize external products to promote sebum on their own bodies. If you've ever heard of lanolin before, that is actually the sebum that you can extract from sheep. And I think back to when I nursed my kids, that lanolin products were always what they recommended for nursing mothers to help protect nipple tissue. The actual sebaceous glands, keep in mind that they are the ones that are connected to the hair shafts, because the job of sebum is to keep those essentially lubricated and protect the hair and the skin. Now, the other one that I wanted to look at, if you're having issues remembering what I'm talking about, you can focus on table 6.2. That also mentions mammary glands in here. But I want to take a moment and look at the ceruminous glands. Ceruminous glands are the ones that produce cerumen, which is your earwax. The yellowish waxy substance that you see in your ears typically is sebum mixed with dead epithelial cells. And the function of this is actually to help keep your eardrum pliable, and it helps to waterproof your ear canal. It's also suspected to kill bacteria, and it makes what we call guard hairs of your ear more sticky to protect the foreign particles from getting into your auditory canal. And essentially, ceruminous glands are modified apocrine sweat glands. Your text also spends some time going into disorders of the integumentary system, and I'm going to let you read through these, but I wanted to spend a little bit more time focusing on acne because I know this was on, I believe, the review guide. So what acne is essentially the inflammation of a hair follicle. And there's different variations of acne. And I found this good picture online that I wanted to share with you, that a healthy hair follicle has the sebaceous glands to them, and the sebaceous glands are producing enough that's able to escape through the opening pore to the skin. But what ends up happening with acne and what forms a whitehead is when your keratinocytes, essentially your epidermal region, those dead skin cells are blocking the opening of your hair follicle, and it causes it to be sealed, where it's almost like a balloon. And then the bacteria that is living in and on our body gets trapped in there, and that area also continues to fill with sebum. And the cover of this is what causes a whitehead appearance. Now, when the whitehead and the bacteria in here essentially get oxidized, it creates the blackhead. And the blackhead essentially is open to the surface. It's called an open comedo. And the black appearance, again, is from oxidation of the sebaceous glands from the bacteria in there. Now, when it starts to get inflamed is when we typically start referring to it as more severe acne. And you can see that what ends up happening in these areas is that as inflammation starts occurring, the white blood cells get recruited, it's attacking the infection of the bacterial cells, and then waste products of that bacteria and the white blood cells accumulate, and that's what produces the pus. So you get the papule that then becomes the pustule. Now, treatment of this. Normally, there's exfoliating facial washes that are supposed to keep the keratinocytes that have formed on the stratum corneum layer to allow your skin pores to stay open. And then the different types of therapies, there's lots of variations of these, but there's benzols, there's retinols, and essentially retinol is derived from vitamin A. And vitamin A, what it's supposed to do is take those cornified cells to help detach them enhance the shedding or the exfoliation. And it's also supposed to increase mitosis activities that helps to keep pushing out the dead cells at the surface of your skin, and would allow the actual pore to be open and reduce the bacterial content in those areas. And that's kind of the goal. The different variations up here, you can see the majority of them are focusing on some type of antibiotic or product that decreases the abnormal follicular keratinization. If you're dealing with oral types of hormones or retinols, those focus on reducing your sebum production. Antibiotics are going to be the ones that kill the bacteria to reduce the number, and then the antibiotics are typically the ones that help to reduce the actual inflammation that you get. So there's lots of products on the market, but each one is trying to target something about either the keratinocytes that are blocking the pore or the bacteria that's found in the pore. The last little bit that I want to address are skin disorders. I primarily want to focus on skin cancer and burns. And with skin cancer, this was one of your thinking about worksheet questions where I wanted you to identify the 3 types of skin cancer based on where they originate. There's basal cell carcinoma, which is pictured in A. This is the most common type of skin cancer. It's considered the least dangerous because it seldom metastasizes. And the reason it's called basal cell carcinoma is because it forms from cells in the stratum basal layer. As far as the appearance of it, it's a small shiny bump and it has a central depression, typically with beaded edges to it. The second image here is of squamous cell carcinoma, and this one comes from the stratum spinosum layer, where it's arising from your keratinocytes. You typically find these lesions on the scalp, your ears, potentially the lower lip and the back of the hand. These are raised, reddened, and scaly in appearance, and they start to form a concave ulcer the longer they're present. There's chance of recovery with early detection and removal, but it does tend to metastasize to lymph nodes within the dermal and hypodermal regions and can become lethal. Malignant melanoma, which is pictured in C, arises from your melanocytes. And this is less than 5% of skin cancers that are detected, but it can be successfully removed if it's caught early, but it can be fatal if it metastasizes. Normally, we look at familial history with melanomas because that's your greatest risk factor. And evidence has revealed that its highest incidences are in men, redheads, and people who have had severe sunburns as a child. So skin cancer, remember, is caused by mutations within a cell that prevents normal cell division processes. Normally, one mutation your body can overcome and fix the issue or cause apoptosis, but if there are multiple mutations, that is what typically leads to a cell becoming cancerous. Now, when we look at sunburns and burns in general, sunburns do not necessarily mean that you're going to get skin cancer. They just put you at a higher risk for them. When you're dealing with types of burns, the injury degree that you look at, whether it's 1st degree, 2nd degree, or 3rd degree, has to do with how far the damage goes into your skin. If it's in the outermost layer or the epidermis, it's going to be a 1st degree burn. That is your typical sunburns most of the time. The 2nd degree is when the damage penetrates to your dermal layer, and it's referred to as a partial thickness burn because it doesn't get all the way through it. It's going to appear red, potentially tan or white, and it blisters and becomes painful. It can take about 2 weeks or several months to heal, depending on the severity of it, and it can leave scars. 3rd degree burns are full thickness burns that go not only from the epidermis through the dermis, but all the way down to the hypodermis. And it often requires skin grafts, and you need fluid replacement, infection control, and nutrition supplementation. When it comes to third-degree burns, the reason why it is so problematic is because all of the protective layers have been burned away, and you're down into the area of your blood flow primarily, and that's why you need to have those skin grafts to aid with this. Now, when you're dealing with first-degree and second-degree burns, the second-degree burns tend to need a little bit more assistance as far as fighting off infection and that kind of thing. The first-degree burns are the ones that you can do topical ointments to soothe it, and it will get better. The other reason why, when you have severe burns, such as third-degree burns, it doesn't immediately feel painful is because all of the nerve endings in this area have been severed. So it takes a little while for the surrounding nerve endings to start to sense that there is pain with it. I did want to spend a moment to talk about UV rays and sunscreen, which is one of the deeper insights in your lab or in your textbook. And I want to make sure you all are aware that there is no such thing as a healthy tan. The UVA versus the UVB rays, when we first discovered them and were linking them to cases of cancer, the UVB rays are what scientists originally thought were the burning rays, but both UVA and UVB can actually cause mutations within our DNA. The sunscreens that are marketed all over these days do protect you from sunburn, but we don't know if it provides you protection against cancer because the UV radiation can still cause mutations. The higher the SPF numbers you see at the store, they can give you a false sense of security. And the Australian government has actually looked into this, and SPFs higher than 30 don't really provide that much more protection. SPF 30 gives you about 97% protection against the UV rays, but you have to reapply your sunscreen. Just because you put sunscreen on doesn't mean you're good for the entire day. You should actually be reapplying like every hour or a couple hours, depending on how long you're out. The sunscreen itself, some of them have chemicals in them that can damage your DNA as well and generate free radicals, which start stealing electrons from healthy atoms in the body. So be aware of what sunscreen products you actually purchase and make sure that you're trying to buy something that is not a chemical linked to potential cancer-causing agents. Now, the last little bit from your review guide for this focuses on how the integumentary system affects other organ systems. And I'm not going to go through all of this like a laundry list, but I want to point out that most of this relates to calcium usage in the body. And vitamin D, which starts to get synthesized in your skin, and again, it finishes in the liver and the kidney, but it helps with calcium resorption of our body. So maintaining proper calcium levels in the body. Calcium is necessary for muscle contractions and your nervous system, as far as the synapses sending signals from one neuron to another. Calcium is also important in the calcium homeostasis of our endocrine system involving our bones. So calcium is kind of the key takeaway of how the integumentary system links to the other systems in the body. We'll talk about calcium homeostasis and the hormones involved with it when we get into the bone. And the very last thing, I typically always ask you to look up how a body system is impacted by aging and senescence. And aging is all the changes that occur in our body just with the passage of time. So growth, development, and the degenerative changes that occur later in life. Senescence is the degeneration that occurs in an organ after the age of its peak functional efficiency. So you kind of get this gradual loss of reserve capacities. You have a reduced ability to repair your damage and compensate for stressors, and it increases your susceptibility to disease. So when we look at skin, as far as the aging of skin is concerned, it becomes a little bit more noticeable in your late 40s, and it has to do with less collagen production. Our bodies start to make less of our eumelanins. You start to get gray hair. Your hair starts to thin because you are not producing as much keratin either. Not as much sebum gives you dry hair. The paper thin and loose skin that sags is a result of collagen reduction. And then your dry skin that bruises more easily and it heals more slowly. It has to do with actually our blood flow and that kind of thing. You start to get more patches of dilated vessels that are visible on your nose and your cheeks. It's because you don't have as much collagen blocking those deeper skin layers. You have less fat retention, which can lead to hypothermia, or you get cold more frequently. You get atrophy and just cutaneous vessels, your sweat glands, the subcutaneous fat. So things just kind of shrink. And then you get less vitamin D production, which can cause calcium deficiencies. And this picture is actually a good picture to show like how plump the skin is in an infant versus someone older in age. Photoaging is another thing that happens with our skin, which that's because of degeneration proportion to your UV exposure. So that would include your skin spots, potential skin cancer, and wrinkling. So this concludes the video on the integumentary system. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to your instructor.